The billionaire caught his black maid dancing with his deaf twins, and what they did next in the kitchen left him stunned. In a mansion frozen by grief, where laughter had been absent for years, lived two boys trapped in silence. Noah and Ethan, twins born deaf, lost their mother on the very day they were born. Their father, William Will Carter, a man of few words, believed nothing could ever reach his sons again, until a new housekeeper arrived, Aaliyah James. At the iron gates, the guard scanned her papers and stared at Aaliyah longer than necessary. "Are you here for a delivery?" he asked, polite but firm. "I'm the new maid for the Carter household," Aaliyah replied, her professional smile steady. The electric lock clicked as if demanding one more layer of proof. Aaliyah drew in a single breath and stepped forward. Inside, Mrs. Whitman, the head housekeeper, led her down a hallway heavy with the scent of waxed wood. "This house requires order and quiet. No attention, no experiments," she said, eyes glued to the schedule board. Aaliyah nodded, though her gaze stayed warm like a lamp switched on in a dark room. At noon, Noah and Ethan sat at the kitchen table, their small faces blank, arms wrapped tight as if clutching the last bit of warmth. Aaliyah stood by the sink, counting her breaths. Then she pulled a small speaker from her cloth bag and played an Aretha Franklin track, volume low, just enough to make the table hum. She expected nothing. She only swayed her shoulders, tapped her foot, drew rhythm with her hands. Ethan tapped his heel against the floor. Noah looked up, brows furrowed in question. A tiny giggle slipped out of the silence, fragile yet blazing. Aaliyah bent down, eye level with them. "Gentlemen," her lips shaped the words as her hands brushed theirs, tying movements like ribbons around their wrists. Ethan stood wobbling. Noah clutched her apron for balance. Awkward, radiant steps. Laughter grew louder, bouncing off brick walls like a heart waking from long sleep. Mrs. Whitman appeared in the doorway, lips pressed tight. "Miss James, don't turn the kitchen into a stage." Aaliyah lowered the volume, smiled, but her hands kept the rhythm patient, tender. She was used to polite reminders that placed her on the story's edges. At that very moment, Will entered to retrieve a folder he'd forgotten. His hand slackened. Before him, the children who had hidden in shadows for 3 years were laughing, clapping, dancing to vibrations felt through the soles of their feet. The rhythm tugged at a memory of Emily, of a summer day when sauce splattered the ceiling and they both burst out laughing. Will's chest tightened. Hope rose rough and jagged, sparking against fear. Noah stumbled. Aaliyah caught him steadying with her gaze and lips. Ethan clapped in rhythm, laughter bubbling like a string of balloons. Will froze at the threshold, the familiar line of an observer. He wanted to ask what she had done to remind her this wasn't part of therapy to silence the speaker and restore order. But he stood still, hand on his chest, feeling something locked away stir. Aaliyah saw him. She didn't stop. She invited him with her eyes. The moment stretched like a deep breath. Will didn't step in, nor did he turn away. He watched until he realized the kitchen felt warm again, as if someone had just opened an oven. Flour dusted the countertop in little clouds. On the floor, tiny footprints smeared with the return of childhood. When the music ended, Aaliyah bowed to the twins and clapped softly. Ethan hugged her leg. Noah held his brother's hand. The invisible thread binding the three made Will feel like a late guest. "Thank you," he said, not sure to whom. Aaliyah gave a small nod. Outside, the trees stirred gently. Inside, something had cracked open and light began to seep through. Very softly. The next morning, Will came down to the kitchen earlier than usual. His shirt buttons undone, coffee still steaming, yet his voice was sharp. "Miss James, what exactly were you trying to do with my children yesterday? Joy is not part of the treatment plan. Aaliyah set down the paring knife, turned to face him. Mr. Carter, joy is what they've been starved of all these years. The air tightened like a drawn string. Mrs. Whitman stood at the end of the counter pretending to check the roster, her glance quick and warning. Will pressed on. They need schedules, therapy structure. Aaliyah answered slowly. And they need to live. I'm not replacing the doctors. I'm only clearing a path so they'll want to step forward. Will fell silent, dark circles shadowing his eyes. He wasn't used to being challenged, least of all by a black woman working under his roof. He turned away, telling himself order must be preserved, that emotions couldn't be signed off on. But throughout the day, Aaliyah kept answering with action. Twisting shirts into hand puppets, she invented tiny characters with lopsided voices who bowed before slipping into a cupboard. Sweeping became a relay race. The broom a baton, and Ethan shouted something that sounded like "day" every time the handle hit the line. Dishwashing turned into a bubble carnival. With one breath, Aaliyah sent foam drifting like tiny planets, and Noah chased after them, popping each star. Laughter trickled through the house, settling on the staircase railings like morning dew. From the upstairs landing, Will watched. His gaze carried both pride and envy. Why could this woman, the same one the guard had mistaken for a delivery girl, unlock a door that countless specialists had failed to open? He saw himself left outside the warm circle she had built, and it stung. Yet he didn't go down. He stayed the observer, teaching himself to breathe with the sound of his children's laughter without admitting it. Late that afternoon, while picking up toys that had rolled under the cabinet, Aaliyah found a silver picture frame covered in dust. She wiped the glass clean. Emily appeared, bright eyes, a smile tilted like sunlight. Aaliyah didn't put it back on the high shelf. She set it low at the children's eye level. The next morning, as Noah ran around the living room, he froze before the photo. He pressed his hand to the glass, turned to Ethan, then slowly spread his fingers into a clumsy sign. Mama. Aaliyah didn't interrupt. She knelt beside them, laid a light hand on their backs, letting memory flow at its own pace. When Will entered, he froze. His two children faced the woman in the photo, their small hands curved into the word he had long avoided. His chest throbbed as if someone had knocked 3 times from inside. He sank to his knees, his voice cracking like dry wood. Yes, that's your mother. Noah beamed. Ethan leaned his head against his father's shoulder. In that moment, Aaliyah stepped back half a pace. She didn't intrude on the center of the picture. She stayed at the edge, like a doorway left open to the light. That evening, Emily's old neighbor, Victoria Langley, stopped by with a basket of pastries. It's wonderful, the children are finally lively again, she said, then turned to Aaliyah. You're the nanny, quite gifted. The word nanny dropped like a stamp, slotting Aaliyah into a smaller box. Will, always courteous, just smiled faintly and thanked her. Aaliyah returned the smile, but when Victoria left, she lingered at the window for a long time, staring into the darkening sky as if measuring her place in this house. Night fell. Will uncorked a bottle of wine, sitting alone in his study. Inside him, 2 forces clashed: his need for control and the echo of his children's laughter. He feared hope. It had betrayed him the day Emily was taken away. But Noah's sign for Mama had undone a lock. He wondered if he could believe in something without numbers, without charts. In the kitchen, Aaliyah washed the last glass, turned off the light, and walked down the dim hallway, hearing the patter of little feet running in dreams like waves breaking on shore. Aaliyah's notebook was filled with arrows and sketches of hands. She was teaching herself ASL through evening videos, jotting down the first words: play, happy, love. That morning, she spread the notebook open on the living room rug, kneeling at eye level with Noah and Ethan. She signed slowly, clearly letting her hands pronounce what her heart wanted to say, play happy love. Noah furrowed his brow in concentration. Ethan mimicked clumsily. Both burst into laughter when their fingers stumbled out of rhythm. It was the laughter of travelers who had just discovered a new path through the forest. Will leaned against the doorway. His eyes met Aaliyah's. She didn't speak, only nodded an unspoken invitation. Will stepped cautiously onto the edge of the rug. The hand that once only knew how to sign contracts trembled. He drew a deep breath, letting his shoulders fall as if shedding armor. Then he signed a single word he had never dared Papa. The air cracked silently. Noah's mouth opened in awe, his hands clapping his chest. Ethan wrapped himself tight around his father's arm. In that moment, Will was no longer the Empire's executive, nor the storm's survivor. He was just a father who had finally learned his children's language. A message from the hospital flashed Dr. Harold Stein would be visiting that afternoon. Aaliyah gathered up the toys. Will straightened his collar and lined the boys neatly on the sofa. Dr. Stein arrived on time, shook Will's hand, nodded at Aaliyah, and said in a measured tone, "Thank you, Miss James, for your support." The word support was feather-light but iron-heavy. It placed Aaliyah outside the circle of authority. He opened his folder eyes, scanning every twitch of the children like a microscope. "Can you show the doctor the new signs you learned?" Will encouraged, his voice a little too bright. Noah raised his hand, but when he caught the stranger's piercing gaze, his fingers froze. Ethan slid closer to Aaliyah, burying his face in her apron that still smelled faintly of soap. Silence. Will urged, "Come on, son, sign it." Too quickly. Dr. Stein jotted notes calmly. He looked up. Children often imitate in play settings. That doesn't necessarily equate to meaningful progress. I'm glad the family is having quality time, but please don't confuse feelings with developmental milestones. The words, "don't confuse," drifted through the room like a cold draft. Will felt his heart sink like an elevator dropping a floor. He looked at his children silent, clutching Aaliyah. The shame of needing proof twisted into anger. He needed somewhere to unload the ache. Aaliyah unconsciously was the closest place. "You gave me an illusion," Will said, voice hoarse. "Anyone can make kids laugh. When it matters, they go silent again." Aaliyah straightened eyes, still gentle but unyielding. "Here, faith is what keeps them alive," she said slowly. "Reports don't teach children to wait their turn to meet someone's eyes to name their feelings. I'm not replacing doctors. I only open the door so they'll want to walk through." Dr. Stein glanced at his watch. "I only want to avoid false hope," he replied, tone neutral. "Hope isn't false," Aaliyah answered. "Only adults are afraid of it." The doctor's mouth twitched. He closed his folder, excused himself, and left. The door shut like a silent verdict. Will turned away. His hand trembled with anger at himself more than at her. He had laid out his children like specimens begging for approval. When it didn't come, he had hurled the storm at the only person who had coaxed laughter back into the house. Aaliyah held the boys, smoothing their backs as though flattening wrinkles in a shirt. She didn't cry, but her gaze passed through Will like a mirror, reflecting a man so afraid he had to be cruel to hope. Afternoon shadows stretched across the porch. Mrs. Whitman reminded Aaliyah about the dinner schedule, tugging everything back to order. Aaliyah nodded, returned to her tasks, the clink of silverware filling the space. Will stayed behind unmoving. He listened to his children's footsteps dart back and forth, then fade. The house regained its order, but it was the kind that made breathing heavy. Down in the kitchen, the little speaker lay still inside Aaliyah's cloth bag, weighted like a forbidden secret that had just been banned from shining. Still there. In the days that followed, the house slid into a kind of winter. Aaliyah still did everything on time, every task done right, but laughter had ebbed away like the tide. Noah and Ethan clung to her more, their eyes searching for a signal the adults hadn't yet returned. Will locked himself in his study, touching files, only to set them aside as if the gesture itself was a ritual of control. In his mind, the doctor's words overlapped with the hurt in Aaliyah's eyes, forming a double exposure he couldn't erase. On Thursday evening, while Aaliyah set the dinner table, she pushed her cloth bag onto a chair. Noah spotted the corner of the speaker peeking out like a glowing secret. He tugged it free, set it on the floor. Ethan pressed the button, and the familiar rhythm spilled onto the tiles, vibrating up through their souls. Both boys looked at Aaliyah, then signed together dance. After that, they turned toward the door, raising their small hands slow and clear. Dance Papa. The silence in the house cracked like shattering glass. A beam of sunset slipped through the shutters, scattering golden dust across the floor like fireworks. Aaliyah's heart beat in time with the children's stomping feet. Will stood in the doorway where he had stood too long. In his eyes flickered the fear of looking foolish, weak, lost. But his son's trembling invitation was braver than his own hands. Will stepped forward. He lowered himself, shoulders shaking feet, tapping, letting his body speak the apology his mouth couldn't yet form. Aaliyah smiled, stepping aside to give center stage to father and sons. Laughter broke across the room like sunlight shattering the last ice of winter. When the music stopped, Will was still breathless. He sat on the small step between kitchen and dining room, burying his face in his palms. Aaliyah poured him a glass of water, saying nothing. Their eyes met no battle lines, only the weight of unspoken things. That night, when the house slept, Will opened a drawer locked for 3 years. Inside was a letter he had written to Emily after the twins cried all night their first evening home. He held the pale envelope, then knocked on Aaliyah's door. She answered in a t-shirt and sweatpants, hair tied high, her face a mix of surprise and calm. Will handed her the letter. She sat on the bed's edge, reading slowly, pausing to let him breathe. In it lived fears. He had never confessed that he wasn't enough, would never be enough, and that his children would grow up in a house without anyone speaking their language. At the final line, Aaliyah placed the letter back in his hand, whispering, "Emily would be proud that you stayed." The words smothered a wild fire, leaving warm embers steady enough for another dawn. The next morning, Mike, the driver, stopped in for coffee. Seeing Aaliyah playing soft music while the boys swayed, he blurted, "Beautiful dancing, Miss James. Must be lively in your neighborhood." Aaliyah's smile faltered for a beat. Will entered just in time, his voice clear. "Here she's the one who brought my children back." Mike stammered an apology and slipped out quickly. Usually, careless words evaporated, but this time they were pinned down by a voice that had chosen sides. That night, the kitchen glowed again. Aaliyah had the boys racing brooms across a taped finish line. Noah won, and Ethan laughed as he wrapped his arm around him. Will stood in the middle of the kitchen, not at the threshold. He apologized to Aaliyah, not with hedging, not with vague phrases like, "if I hurt you." He apologized for demanding metrics for something that was their lifeblood. Aaliyah nodded, no speech, just signed one word. "Continue," Will signed back together. The twins clapped like tiny thunder. Late that night, Aaliyah returned to her room, opened her journal. She wrote that some recognitions don't need awards, only a shift in place between those involved. She also wrote of Bridges' music, vibration, eye contact, hands. As for Will, after tucking the boys in, he returned to his desk. He placed Emily's letter back in the drawer, but this time he didn't lock it. Neat yet open. Like his heart now, still cautious but leaving space for the wind to pass through. On a soft, breezy morning, Aaliyah planted colorful ribbons along the grass path, tying them to small wooden sticks. She signed to the children, "Follow the colors one step, then another." Ethan went first arms, swinging for balance. Noah moved slower, glancing up now and then to ask if he could keep going. She nodded, gave a thumbs up, then stepped back like someone lighting a lantern without blocking its glow. The boys stumbled, fell, brushed off. Grass stood up and kept moving. Each fall was a short lesson in courage. Aaliyah signed strong, continue proud. At that moment Noah stopped, turned to his father, lifted his small hands and signed slowly. Come papa. 2 words, like a rope, tossed across a river that had run between them for years. Will ran. He ran, as if slowing down might dissolve the fragile bridge. He knelt arms wide, pulling both boys into his chest. Tears broke free, old and new all at once. Ethan tucked into his collar, Noah stroked his father's face with his little palm. Aaliyah stepped back, hand pressed to her chest. Everyone understood without her this moment would never have come. Time passed. The Carter mansion changed rhythm stairs smeared with color toy cars, hidden in the sofa handprints on window glass. Will sat cross-legged on the floor, learning signs, reading stories, clumsy but warm. Aaliyah laughed more often. The rooms seemed brighter. One warm evening, Will decided to host a gathering in the garden. Not a lavish party, just a few friends, some neighbors, a couple of therapists. The twins darted among the guests, signing short phrases, taking turns without reminders. Guests widened their eyes, then clapped, then laughed. Dr. Stein arrived a bit late. He stood quietly for a while, watching Noah hand Ethan a block, and wait until he placed it before taking his turn. He saw Ethan sign love as he hugged Will's neck. There were data points no chart could hold in the way a child waited, in the way a child named an emotion. Dr. Stein exhaled, stepped toward Will. I've been overly cautious. What I've seen tonight, it matters. Will only nodded. Music from the small speaker rose enough to make the grass tremble. Mike stood by the fence nodding as he watched Ethan step aside to let another pass. Mrs. Whitman, once frowning at music in the kitchen, set down extra plates, murmured, "Thank you." A neighbor's child tapped Noah's shoulder, copying the sign for "thank you." Noah laughed, gently correcting his hand. Small motions pieced together a new picture of the home. Victoria Langley arrived with a tray of mini tarts. She praised the children, then turned to Aaliyah. "You're the cook, very skillful." The words dropped like a stone. A few guests paused. Aaliyah smiled, ready to reply, but Will stepped in. Standing at the center of the small circle, he spoke clearly. "This is Aaliyah James. She's not just the cook. She's the one who brought my children back and brought me back to them." The air hushed, then warmed again. Victoria whispered an apology. Aaliyah nodded, signed thank you. Night fell. They spread a blanket beneath the tree, the 4 of them sitting close, Aaliyah, Will, Noah, Ethan. They ate misshapen cookies made by small hands. Ethan broke his in half, offering the bigger piece to his brother. Noah pushed it back, dividing it evenly. Will whispered something that made Aaliyah laugh. Her laughter blended with the cicadas and the children's warmth. In that moment, the definition of family rewrote itself, not just blood or portraits on a high shelf, but presence, learning each other's language, fixing mistakes, standing up after falls. Aaliyah didn't replace Emily. She opened a new chapter where memory and the present could live together without devouring each other. Will looked at her then, at his sons, and signed love with hands once used only to sign contracts. As his hands closed, a breeze swept through, brushing the ribbons along the grass path. They fluttered like tiny roads, reminding them they had found each other, and from here would walk on together. Warm, gentle, steady. From the kitchen, where a small dance lit the first spark to the ribboned garden, where Will knelt and embraced his sons. we've seen how love willing to learn another's language can heal an entire home. Aaliyah didn't replace the past. She opened a door where memory and the present live side by side, where laughter without sound still carries far. Now, a question for you. Which moment touched you the most when Noah signed Mama? When Will's hand shook as he signed Papa? Or when the twins invited Dance Papa and the wall of pride crumbled? Share your feelings in the comments. I'd love to read your story. If this video touched you, share it with someone who needs a spark of hope, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Every bit of your support helps us bring more journeys of healing like this one.